I've come to pretty fundamentally believe that some things cannot and should not be discussed outside of personal experience. Now, that might sound odd coming from someone with a relatively traditional education in Western philosophy, but, well, here I am. One of the keenest examples of this is gun violence. See, the way I see it, despite the numbers, despite the mathematics, everything stops with the phrase, "I lost a loved one," or "I almost died." All that math, all those statistics only matter in the light of the value of human life. And the value of human life is established in places we call emotional or even sentimental, things outside mathematics and statistics. Taylor Schumann's accounting of gun violence is personal, and in my opinion, that makes it powerful. Not because the story is dramatic or even culturally triggering, but because there are only so many people who have heard gunshots near them and face the actual reality that they might die at the wrong end of a gun. Taylor Schumann has. And because she has, I believe her. And I think what she says matters. I think you will too. Check it out. Where are you calling me from? Or where are you receiving this call from? Where are you?
I am in Charleston, South Carolina.
Charleston, South Carolina. It's
Yes.
a vacation spot for a lot of people.
It is. Yes.
Is that home for you? Is that where you were born and raised?
No, I'm actually from Southwest Virginia. My husband and I moved here about 2 years ago. He matched here for his pharmacy residency program.
Oh, okay.
And we just really liked it, so we decided to stay.
Do you consider it home now? Does that feel like home now, or where are you? Where in Virginia are you from?
I'm from Salem. Yeah, which is like right outside of Roanoke, Virginia. My husband's from nearby there too. But yeah, Charleston definitely feels like home. We were able to buy a house about a year ago, and we have a 2.5-year-old, and yeah, he has a great little school here, and we have a great church. So yeah, we really love it.
Is that the stuff for you? Is that the stuff that makes it feel home? Is like the church community? Does where you grew up still feel like home, or is it like that? Does it kind of move with you? Is it like some insurance where it's like it's depending on the car you're in, you're now insured here? Is that where home is? It's like what you build. Like what's that look like for you?
Yeah, we have moved a few times, like since we've been married. We lived in Tennessee for about 5 years before we came here. And so I think we've always just kind of been able to like plant wherever we go.
Okay.
But when we go home to visit family, it definitely still feels like home.
Okay.
But yeah, once we started having those connections here, getting our son in school and stuff like finding a doctor and a dentist and just like
The functional
stuff like that.
stuff of
Yeah.
life. Yes.
Yeah, that like really was like, oh, we live here. We have a dentist here. Like this is our home. Like,
That's pretty good.
so yeah.
And you've got one child.
Yes, Henry. He's almost 3.
Yeah, I saw a recent one of your recent Instagram posts in which there are probably 1.5 billion Legos on the floor. You're like, I have one kid. Like, it's
One,
amazing.
yeah. Like my friends that have multiple, I'm like,
How?
how?
Yeah.
Where did they go? Because I have one, and
Where did they go? It's very good.
So, but we have 2 dogs. One that's a German Shepherd puppy still, so I feel like that's a couple more kids also.
Yeah, yes and no.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
And you are as of not too long from now, July 20th, you'll be a published author. It's your first book.
Yes.
Was that a dream plan? Was it in the works somewhere, like in the recesses of your brain as a person growing up, where you're like, I will someday write a book? Or was this like stirred by the particular moment? Like, what brings you to become an author? Was it in you already, or is this like, I need to put this thing somewhere and a book makes sense? How did book writing happen for you?
It's been in me my whole life. Like
Really?
my parents, like my dad especially, would always say like, oh yeah, Taylor's gonna write a book someday. So I always thought maybe I'd write like fiction books, like novels, or even like children's books.
Okay.
Um, and so, after this happened, like writing was a way I found a lot of healing and like did a lot of processing and stuff. And so it just kind of started to seem like, well, I want to write a book. Like I could
Yeah.
write a book about this.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a dream come true, just not this specific topic.
You're like, I'm hoping at some point I'm shot so that I can get this
Yeah, so I
book
can
out.
write a book. Yeah, like that, like when I get messages that's like, you just wanted to be famous. I'm like, yes, this is
Yeah.
my long con uh,
We're definitely gonna get into that. It's a fascinating thing
to
that happens
become famous.
once you touch one of those third rail topics. Folks have
Yeah.
all kinds of opinions about why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Um, Talk briefly about the impetus for this particular book for folks, for my listeners who won't necessarily know who you are quite yet, and like why. It'll be, I will mention in the introduction, but you decided to write a book about being shot, and
Mhm.
it's not just like, hey, I was shot, I'm a victim memoir. You kind of do a thing with the book that's it. The subtitle has to do with a shooting survivor's journey into the realities of gun violence. So you're taking your moment
Mhm.
and using that moment or entering into like a pretty big, um I will use the word ugly, you don't have to say it, like ugly
Yeah.
conversation,
Mhm.
in America specifically, about guns, gun use, and gun violence.
Mhm.
Um, Catch us up briefly on like the impetus for this book, your like personal process in deciding to write it. Like, how do you get there?
Yeah, after I was shot, obviously that was like my initial like entry point to gun violence. Like I was experiencing gun violence. I was a victim of gun violence.
Yes.
But a school shootings in general are a really small part of gun violence in America. So I still didn't know much about sort of the everyday types of gun violence that are
Hmm.
going on in America. Firearm suicides, domestic violence incidents, like children finding loaded guns and killing themselves or killing other people by accident. These types of instances that are much more common than like a school shooting or a mass shooting. So I still didn't really know a lot about it, and I didn't really have um, to know because I'd experienced this one very small part, and I had grown up pro gun. I was still pro gun for a while after I had been shot, so it wasn't like an automatic
Mm-hmm.
switch had been flipped. And so once I started learning, I started meeting other survivors and hearing other people's stories and just seeing how this one instance of gun violence had affected me and my family and would continue to affect me for the rest of my life. I could no longer like turn away from that
Yeah.
in a large scale way anymore. And, definitely went down a path of research and introspection and evaluating my beliefs and things I'd always believed and why. And did that still fit anymore?
Yeah.
And I found that it didn't. Um,
You said a couple things in here I want to dig into. One of them is, I think it's a really interesting distinction that you, to some degree, make with the book, and you even did it in a sentence. Is it's kind of a hallmark difference between victimhood and something
mhm,
more like citizenship or advocate. Something is,
mhm,
if when you're talking like mass shootings or like a school shooting, are, you said, like a smaller part of a much larger world. The part
mhm,
of what victimhood will do long term is that we end up projecting, like, this is my
mm,
experience, and therefore the world around me is shaped this way by, through the lens of my personal experience. And that can be true for a time, depending on what you've been victimized by, what you've been hurt by. Like, live there, because
yeah.
that sucked for you. But the longer journey is like, this moment, whether it's an assault or whether it's being shot, or whether it's domestic abuse, like, is part of a much larger world that then,
Mhm,
like, even my own experience is a part of and subject to, that my rules and my safety and my comfort aren't actually definitive of the whole thing. Neither are my policy preferences.
Mm-hmm.
So entering into that kind of broader space, that's part of your journey. Is like there are things that you believed about the world politically, socially that changed not just because of your experience, but because through your experience you came into a much larger world of violence and gun ownership.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's powerful. Can you talk briefly about what it meant for you to be, because you used the phrase pro gun.
Mm-hmm.
What did it mean previously for you to be pro gun? What does it mean to be pro gun? That's for me that's a confusing, not because you said it, but it's always been confusing to me as a person.
Sure.
What does it mean to be pro gun? What did it mean for you to be pro gun?
Yeah, I think in general, like when we use the term pro-gun, we're describing people who are very pro Second Amendment, very pro, so for having a gun in their home, maybe for self-defense, maybe for fun as a hobby, maybe
Mm-hmm.
they like to go shooting practice. And in general, I think it sort of describes someone who is pro-gun with very little regulation or very little concern for um, what possessing a gun means for the larger community.
Yeah.
Um,
And so you
yeah.
you were a person who felt on principle people should have access to guns if they want, whatever restrictions are on the table, whatever the bar is you're supposed to clear the bar, and if you can clear the bar, whatever that bar is, you should have access to guns. That's changed for you.
Hmm.
Can you talk about
Yeah.
what it looks like for you? Are you anti-gun? Like what happened? Like for folks who are gonna like, oh, you were pro-gun, now you're anti-gun. Like how do you describe your position now?
Yes. Okay. So I personally, because I think that yeah, there's a couple levels to this.
Good.
So I personally, for my own life, my own family, am anti-gun. We decided long ago we wouldn't have a gun in the home. That's just not part of how we are choosing to live our lives.
Mm-hmm.
However, that does not mean I'm anti-gun for everyone. That doesn't mean I want to get rid of everyone's guns. I can be personally anti-gun and still respect the fact that we do have a constitutional amendment that says people have the right to bear arms. Um, so for me, what that looks like is being thoughtful in the way that I consider what the Second Amendment was intended for and what it can look like in a modern age now that we
Mm-hmm.
have all sorts of kinds of guns and all sorts of accessories for guns and
Yes.
ammo that we did not have at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment, and being wise and knowledgeable and evaluating what regulations for guns would be smart, what seems to work, and figuring out how that can look for people who do want to keep their guns and do want to own guns and think
Yeah.
they want to have a gun for self-defense. There are ways to figure out how those two can coexist, and that's what I'm really trying to do.
How interested are you in being involved in like actual policy conversation? Because you're gonna like, especially once the book is out, you'll have a story. You're a white woman. Your
Yes.
opinion holds a very particular. You're a white woman, and therefore your opinion holds a
Yeah.
very particular weight in the
Yeah.
conversation about gun violence.
Hmm.
How interested are you in like actually being in policy conversation at the cost that comes with? Is that a thing you're looking for, seeking?
It is. It's not something I want to do full time,
Yeah.
but it's definitely, I've been able to have conversations with a couple political leaders, and I enjoy doing that. What I enjoy doing is giving people insight into what it's like to be a shooting survivor, what it's like to kind of live in the aftermath in a country that
Yes.
doesn't really seem to weigh that type of experience very much when it comes to our gun
It
laws.
really doesn't.
But I think that really matters, right? Like sharing our stories, giving people a face to think about when they're casting their votes for certain type of legislation. I That is what interests me more than um, maybe lobbying for specific gun laws, which is still very meaningful work, and I'm still happy to do that when I can. But with the caveat that I never want to do that if there's not many seats at the table for people who've experienced other types of gun violence, people who don't look like me,
Yes.
people who live in communities that I am not part of.
Yes.
Because, like you said, I'm a white woman, and I experienced a very specific type of gun violence
Yes.
that doesn't have one that people don't mind talking about. It's on the news, a school shooting, a mass shooting. Oh, it's so sad, it's so
Hmm.
devastating, and of course it is. But who we need to hear from, along with me, maybe even more than me in many cases, is people who are experiencing everyday gun violence in places in our country that we don't seem to care very much about,
Yes.
or we say, oh, well, that's the city. It's so violent there. We can't, we're not touching it. There, it's just violence.
It's
And
fascinating the way those things get divided up, and I'm thinking about two examples,
yes,
and that's part of, and that's part of why I point out like you being a white woman,
yeah,
is so one is so like 2020 there were fewer, which is this fascinating thing. People are like, well, there were fewer mass shootings. Like, well, no one was outside.
yeah,
Um, but still, when you check out the statistics, and I think it was the Washington Post who posted the article, and then the way they break up the data, there were still like 20,000 people. This is the way it's broken up. It's fascinating to me. There
yeah,
were 20,000 people killed in what they call gun violence, and then they split off this entire other section of 24,000 people who died by suicide, as
yeah,
if there's this like intrinsic distinction between injuring yourself and injuring someone else with a gun. I don't get that. Like, that's fascinating to me that we'll split those two things up. And then the second thing is, today we're talking. This is June 22nd, and
hmm
on it's a Tuesday night. So two nights ago, in Richmond, California, which is 7 miles that direction from me, uh,
yeah,
3 kids killed, 5 injured at a party. And the reason this isn't going to make national news is because it's in Richmond, California, which is a
yeah,
predominantly black neighborhood. So it's like there's a way in which, like, well, of course those kids get shot. They're black. I mean, it's literally in the freaking narrative. It's fascinating the way we split these things up. And part of what I feel like you're doing is saying, like, listen, statistics, whether it's 3 killed and 5 injured or it's 24,000, these stories are actually all human stories and should
yeah,
have a weight to them, each. That it
yeah,
shouldn't just be a number. That kind of comes at a cost for you, though, correct? That, like, people have to feel your story.
yeah. They do. Yeah. Um, and I think it's one of those things where if I can get people to feel certain feelings toward me and my story, and not in a manipulative way,
No.
of course, just in a way, this is my reality, and I want to share it and invite people in. If I can get people to connect with my story, then that's the point at which I can say, well, you listen to my story.
Yeah.
What do you think about these numbers?
Yeah.
These are all people just like me, and
Yeah.
they just happen to live in a different type of place than I live in.
Yeah.
Um, and what does that look like? And the suicide conversation is always especially interesting to me because
Yes.
when, I'll say, okay, well, every year, and I can't tell you how many times this has happened where I say, wow, every year in America, on average, over 40,000 people die from gun violence. And the first thing people will say is, well, how many of those are suicides?
Right.
As if they don't count,
Yep.
as if it doesn't have anything to do with a gun being present, which we
Yes.
know that it does. We know
Absolutely.
statistically that access to a gun, no matter if it's yours or if it's just in your house, um, you are 3 times more likely to die by firearm suicide.
Yeah.
Just the access to a gun. So of course it's related, and that's what I say. Like, yeah, I mean, I've had times in my life, like after this, where I've been like so low, so depressed, like, and
Yeah.
I've thought, wow, it would be easier just to not be here. And the the access to a gun in that time
Yes.
of my life makes it so much more. likely that I would just say, make a quick decision, the gun's right there, and make that choice. And so of course the gun is involved in this. Of course this is gun violence. And and it's like these people are real human people, and why on earth would we try to separate these? But people have stronger feelings
Yeah.
about the term gun violence when it's a, you know, a dangerous
Yes.
person that has a gun.
Yeah.
We just care more about those types of stories, and people say, well, they made the choice, they decided it's not a danger to the community. Well, of course it is.
It
Of
really
course it
is.
is.
And it's a strange collision, not collision. It's a strange tension in the personal responsibility narrative, right?
Mm,
That a lot of the conversation around gun ownership and gun violence, gun ownership and violence has to do with personal responsibility. But then
mm,
once that personal responsibility conversation gets couched in the decision someone makes to end their own lives, it gets really, really confusing and like nuanced in a way that kind of messes with the personal responsibility narrative as like a monolith that so long as you're being
absolutely.
personally responsible, then you can be a goner. My father ended his life with a handgun,
Mm,
and weeks before that, he had tried to end his life with medication. I found him while he was like I found him in the back of the house, came home, found him on the couch, and he had been pumped full of meds.
mm,
And I was able to carry him to the car and drive him to the hospital and like take care of him. I couldn't do that with the gun.
right.
And the difference there for me, when folks do exactly that, they're like, we talk about gun violence, like, yeah, well, how many of those are suicides? And it's like, I don't know why you write it off as if having access to a gun doesn't make it easier for people who are in low places to end their lives and thereby really injure lots and lots of people who love them. Like,
Yeah.
why is that not like what you know? We that is gun violence. In fact, it's a
Yes.
violence you're perpetrating on lots and lots of people
Yes.
by ending your own life, and having the
Hmm.
gun makes
Yeah.
that. Let's talk about. You mentioned being low, and specifically for you, and this is a conversation. One of the bits of the conversation has to do with gun violence. One of the bits of conversation around gun violence has to do with mental health. Can we
Hmm.
talk about your own process and journey from here? From being injured, from being shot, to putting the book together, and to now thinking about being a public face, like more so than even before, kind of being in this place of authority and
Yeah.
having to carry the story and other people's stories. Talk about your mental health journey and like talk about the things you're doing to stay healthy, stay centered, therapy. Break it all
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. So right after the shooting, I think it was decided by everyone around me, and I'll say this to start off. I am very fortunate to have an amazing family. I was engaged at the time. We were about 6 weeks away from our wedding when the shooting happened. So I had an amazing fiance, my husband now, my family, my in-laws, so many people to support me that a lot of people in my position don't have.
Right.
And so I think it was decided by the masses around me that I needed counseling, and which
Yeah.
is true. I did need counseling. And I said, I don't want to go. I'm not ready to talk about it.
Hmm.
I don't want to go. I don't want to go.
Like
And
for
my
you and for
mom,
you internally, you just weren't in a place where you wanted to be in therapy right away.
it was like I couldn't even think about sitting down with someone and explaining what had
Hmm.
happened to me or talking about it because I didn't even know how to do that for
Hmm.
myself. So I think I was scared.
Yeah.
And so my mom and my fiance basically put me in a car and said, we're going to see a counselor.
Oh wow.
And they had gotten a recommendation from a family friend who was a psychiatrist at the time, and they took me. And by the time I got there, I was like, okay, I'll go. And I sat down in a
I
room
like
with.
that you decided that you would go once you were
I was
there.
already there. Yeah. I sat down and she was like, okay, well, I'm so glad you're here. And I was like, well, yeah, I didn't really have a choice. So I don't recommend the kidnapping to take to therapy method, but in my case, it was effective.
There you go.
But I sat down with the kindest woman in the world. Her name is
Hmm.
Martha, and she was a Christian counselor. And I know that a lot of people have really bad experiences with in a Christian counseling setting, but
Yes.
for me, she was a licensed professional counselor. She just happened to be a Christian, and I needed that at that time. Like,
Yeah.
I needed someone that I could process faith questions with, and that was also a very qualified mental health professional. And I was very thankful to find that. And she was what I needed, and she let me cry and say things that I couldn't say to anyone else. And she helped me basically find a way to be a living human person again.
Yeah.
And that's what I needed to kind of get back into life and figure out what my life was going to look like. And
Yeah.
a couple years later, I transitioned to seeing a psychiatrist that specialized in PTSD. He had worked with, I grew up near Virginia Tech, and I went to Virginia Tech for school, and he had worked with a lot of survivors of that shooting. And he was able to kind of help me understand more of the science stuff, the stuff that was going on in my brain and my body, and what my body was doing and trying to protect me from. And so I like to say, I needed Martha to help heal my heart, and then I needed this doctor to help kind of heal my mind and help
really
me
good.
understand. And I needed both, and now I have another great therapist, so I'm kind of making the rounds. But I love therapy. There's no way I could have healed in the way that I have without people, because I didn't have anyone around me that had experienced gun violence. I felt very alone, and I needed people to help me understand and to say, like, I feel so alone in this. No one understands. I don't understand. Please help me. And I'm thankful that I did, and it helped me learn to recognize things in myself, signs that maybe I'm not functioning so well, or that I've done too much, that I've taken in too much, and I need to kind of recenter. And that has made it possible for me to write this book and to talk about it. Without that kind of foundation, I don't know that I could have done it, because it was really hard to kind of get into this stuff that I went through and give it out to the world. But so for me, when I start feeling really hopeless about the state of the world, or start having thoughts, it's like, well, there's no point in me doing this. Nothing is good. Everything is terrible. I know I need to take a break. And for me, the big thought I have that I know, okay, I've got to chill. I have this thought, I'll read Twitter and see issues and things, and I'll think, well, I can't care about this. I can't care about this. And that for me is always, okay, I gotta take a break.
Oh, good.
I gotta take a break. That's like a big sign. And I've learned that about myself. So now, like I said, I'm seeing my therapist, and she's been so helpful. I'm getting wise counsel from my pastor, who is also an author herself, and just people close to me that I can confide in and talk to. And some days are hard, but God has been really faithful in giving me people like that to mentor me and guide me.
There's a little bit of a narrative parallel and thread running through the therapy conversation, this conversation between you and I about therapy and the experience of gun violence that has to do with control, right? That one of the terrifying things about a shooting, one of the terrifying things about violence in general, whether that's spousal abuse or child abuse or gun violence, any sort of trauma, is the lack of control. I don't have control over it. I'm not in a position I can't protect myself. Similarly with therapy, and I get it is slightly funny that your family kidnapped you to take you to therapy. The other side of the coin there is also like the terror that comes from experiencing something in my own mind, my own body, that I don't have handles for, I don't have language for, and I feel lost in my own psychology. Which can very much feel similar to being stuck in a mall with a shooter on the loose. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know if he's coming back in the room. I don't know these things. I know that I've got stuff going on. It's one of the reasons this podcast is supported by BetterHelp, because I constantly come back to conversations with folks on the podcast and in between podcasts in which they're up against exactly this. I have stuff happening to me. I don't have language for. I don't have, in a sense, power over. And a therapist, a really good therapist, can give you that language to
Yeah.
say, hey, listen, you were overpowered. You were overwhelmed. Let's give you
Yeah.
language to understand that by.
Yeah.
Some of that language for you, and I want to come back to, I want to talk about Twitter in a little bit, briefly, which is
Yeah.
always the way I want to talk about Twitter, to talk about trauma. Um, I want to talk about the language around religion for you,
Yeah.
because there's and I'm going to make an assumption here, and I'm super okay being wrong about it. But there's a little bit of a tension here because you even in the way you write your story initially, you lean heavily, like even in the moment, you lean heavily on your own religious convictions, beliefs. Like, there's a moment of prayer.
Hmm.
You recall, like, during, like, while you'd been shot and you're bleeding, you're actually, like, remembering scripture from the Bible. You're praying. You're leaning into your faith. You're depending on your faith.
Hmm.
At the same time, a lot of the I'll say it like this. This is my language. It doesn't have to be yours, so you can respond to this and however you want to.
Sure.
The dominant religious culture
Hmm.
in our world is a religious culture that champions access to guns
Hmm.
for people like Neil McInnes.
Hmm.
That's a bit of a tension there. That this is a place in religious, your religious convictions are, you're couched in a religious understanding of who God is and God's availability to you. And then the dominant voice who carries that culturally into the world is also the same voice that it's saying people like him should have access to guns if they
Yeah.
want them. Is that do you feel that tension in you socially or emotionally, where, like, this is who I am, this is also who I am, I like here, I don't like? Talk about that for a little while. Like,
Yeah.
this is family business, this is cultural
Yeah.
business, that's hard, that's weird.
Yeah.
You're a Christian, Christians want
Yeah.
people to have guns, that's also
Yeah.
weird. Can you talk a little bit about that, Soup? I don't need you to have a specific answer, but, like,
No,
wow,
it's good.
that's bonkers. Yes?
Yeah. Yes. And so, yeah, when I talk about this, for people who don't know me or who haven't, followed me for a bit, they might think that, I was pro-gun, I got shot, and then I was anti-gun, and, boom, boom, boom.
Right.
And that's really not what happened. There was a period in there where I was processing, I was kind of asking myself a lot of these questions,
Yeah.
because I had witnessed this up close and personal.
Yes.
I had looked into the eyes of someone who had a gun and wanted to use it to kill me. And like, I had long been a champion of the right to access that gun with
Yeah.
very little regulation, to being part of that. And so, what I like to say is that God really used my experience to allow me to identify more with people who have experienced all sorts of injustices. Not that I can ever know what it's like, to be in certain groups of people. I can't know what it's like to experience racism or racial violence, or, I've never lived in extreme poverty. I've never been in those marginalized communities, but I experienced God in a way that I hadn't before, which was that I was in a period of extreme suffering,
Hmm.
extreme loss,
Hmm.
extreme physical pain. And suddenly the God of, maybe abundance and safety that I had been connected with for so long and believed in, suddenly I was experiencing, the verses about how, God is near to the brokenhearted and he binds up our wounds.
Yeah.
And, that we're to care for the widow and the orphan, and the people who are in poverty, and we're to care for them and be the hands and feet of Jesus to them. And so experiencing that God,
Hmm.
and experiencing how to love people the way that God loves people, when I started examining, this feeling I had towards the guns and towards the Second Amendment, those things just couldn't fit for me anymore.
Hmm.
It didn't make any sense to me
Wow.
that, like, this was the God that I loved, that loved me, that had shown himself to me. And I also, believe in, like, having a gun to kind of kill anyone, in self-defense, or not that I had ever I didn't have a gun, but, that's what I was supporting for other people to do.
Yep.
or to be able to just buy whatever guns they have, carry them in a grocery store, all these kind of things. I couldn't make those pieces fit together. They
Yeah.
didn't work for me. And that's what ultimately led me to that kind of final transformation where I was like, this can't work for me anymore. And I don't really know how it can work for other people too. And so yeah, that was kind of really how that happened for me.
It is an act of love to, and this is always true. It is an act of love to remain in relationship with, and to remain like publicly associated with people with whom we actually fundamentally disagree on vital things, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's an actual. It's part of what does now and will continue to make what you're doing a loving act is that you're published on InterVarsity Press, who's a wonderful publisher,
Yeah.
whose books predominantly serve a community of people who would normally identify with being pro-gun.
Yeah.
And that as a cultural reality puts you in this very interesting position to lead from a place of vulnerability and power, which is part of why I was asking the therapy question as well, because
Yeah.
that shit's just going to get hard. Can you talk lastly about like the public expression part of this? And we talked about Twitter for a moment. I ask all my guests about, for the most part, all my guests about life online.
Yeah.
Twitter, to some degree, Facebook, they can be really helpful places. They can be really volatile places. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about your experience of life online in this arena.
Yeah.
Is it a helpful place? Is it a healthy place? Is it a place of work? Do you feel connected? Is it just a place for you now where like I can be there for a bit and it's work and then I need to go home? Talk about life online for you now.
Yeah. Yeah. So um I will say that for me, Twitter is my favorite social media platform,
Oh
which is
wow.
something I think a lot of people
You're one of those
cannot
people.
understand.
Yeah, I don't get that.
Well, I am, and this is the thing. I People I've met on Twitter, accounts I followed, helped me transform so much.
Hmm.
Like there are so many stories and people and experiences I have access to through Twitter that I could not have in my own life. And I for a long time was one of those people that kind of like would like tentatively follow people I disagreed with because I was like, I kind of connect with this, but like I don't know, I still believe this other thing.
Hmm.
So I was kind of one of those people that like lurked in the background and then was so changed by many of these voices on Twitter. And I just
Hmm.
thought, well, it worked for me. Like maybe I could start here and connect with people. And my goal there was always to connect with people
Yes.
and then kind of invite them into what I'm talking about and earn their respect that way. But I thought the people who have helped me change and helped me understand things, um, I got to know them first as a person and I respected
Huh.
them as a person. And then I was able to kind of process what they're saying.
Yeah.
And so that's always been the goal for me. And I spent a lot of time kind of like I kind of hate the word curating. It feels very like white lady Instagram,
That's
but
okay.
kind of curating my space. And so I'm connected with really awesome people and I follow people that I really like to follow and I
Yes.
like to see pictures of their kids and I like to hear about what they're doing on the weekend. And then I also like to hear their opinions on things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I love it. But that took time. And like I didn't just log into Twitter and be like, hope it's good. Hope this ends up being a good place. Like
It takes work.
it does. And so
Like all
if
like
you
all relationship, it takes work.
Yes. And so
Yes.
ultimately, I mean, I there's an acknowledgement section in my book for I call my Twitter fam
Hmm.
for people on Twitter who encourage me and pray for me. I mean, during the writing of this book, I had friends there kind of coordinate, and they started sending me like little care packages and stuff to encourage me because I was just having a really hard time. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these are people who sent me money for meals when I was in a lot of pain and didn't want to cook dinner, and you know, I've just started the launch team for this book, and
Mm-hmm.
we've got about 130-ish really awesome people. And you know how many people I know from like my real in-person life? Less than 10.
Yeah.
And so like these are people who support me and encourage me, and that means everything.
Yeah.
And and that's also where I find that I'm able to really connect with people, share my story, and now I get a lot of messages, and I'm so thankful to be able to say this.
Yeah.
I get so many messages from people that are like, I didn't know a lot about guns, or I was pretty pro gun. We've always had guns, but I read your story. I listen
Hmm.
to things you say, and I really see what you're talking about
That's
now.
good.
And I believe these things. So as often as I get a mean message or a nasty comment or a threat of violence, which
Yeah.
does occasionally happen,
Yep.
for every one of those, there's 50
Yes.
positive
That's
ones.
good.
And that's what I love. And
Yeah.
so yeah, Twitter can be a dumpster fire. Facebook, I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole,
Oh,
but
there you go.
like
Okay.
you can make it you can make it what you would like it to be. And
Yes.
if it's not great, you take a break.
Yeah.
Like,
That's good.
but so for me it's a good place, and I'm thankful for that because I know it's not such for everyone.
It's not. What will it look like for this project specifically to be successful? I'll coach my clients
Mm,
in the direction when we talk about success. The success is a moving target,
yeah.
and really, you get to decide where that target sits. Like as a person, as a as an author, podcaster, whatever it is you're doing, success generally, in my estimation, it really has more to do with like what are you wanting to achieve,
Yeah.
as opposed to like, well, you got to sell 20,000 books and then you're a success. Like, no, who cares? Like rats, no one
Yeah.
cares. For you, how will you know in your own body that this project has been successful? Do you have specific metrics? Do you have visions, dreams, thoughts? What will it mean for this to be successful?
Yeah, I like just had a conversation with my husband kind of about this where I was just saying I don't want to measure the success of this with numbers. Um, what I hope to accomplish with this is something I might not really be able to see.
Hmm.
Um, is that I would love to create a way that people can be thoughtful about their opinions about guns.
Hmm.
Um, I think for a lot of people, you sort of grow into adulthood with the opinions you have had or that have been your family's.
Yes.
Um, and a lot of us, we reach adulthood and we're like, oh, why do I believe that?
Yeah.
Why do I believe that?
Yes.
And I think a lot of people were scared to ask those questions, so sometimes we just don't. Um, but even for the most pro-gun person who might pick up my book, if I can offer them a way to be thoughtful about how they think about guns,
Yes.
that's what I want.
That's good.
And they might read it and consider my points and stay where they're at. And if
Yes.
so, I still consider that a success because they gave it a chance. They read it, they considered it,
Yes.
and I consider that a win.
Yes.
And and just in general, equipping people to enter into these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I've reminded myself, I used to have a sticky note on my computer while I was writing the book and it just said, "Your book will not end gun violence." Just really helped me take the pressure off.
Wow.
My goal here is to share my story, to give people a way to think about gun violence if they've not ever had to before, and to really care for people in their community that are experiencing gun violence, just to think about it more. Um, and that's what I want to see from the
That's
book
good.
more than any number or any sale or if I could hear from a few people that along those lines, I would love to get those kind of messages
Yeah.
and talk to people about that stuff. I would love that. But yeah, it might be things that I can't really see quite yet.
That's good.
And just hoping for peace for that, I guess.
We're in a moment, and by we I mean folks like you and I. We're at a moment in which there is a kind of a kind of courage. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this. There's a kind of courage in taking the responsibility that folks like you and I can have, which is to say, like the ability to wisely, prophetically, and critically speak to privileged, dominant spaces. To do that well and wisely now is a kind of sacred responsibility that yes, it has been like just a lot easier for folks, for white middle upper class folks to just serve white middle upper class spaces.
Yeah.
But the more time has passed with more information, more of a general sense of consciousness with regards to the interconnectedness of things, the kind of responsibility that you have now just to speak to predominantly white, predominantly conservative spaces, predominantly very privileged spaces, about like the connectedness, their gun ownership, our gun ownership, and black violence.
Yeah.
You get access to places, you will have access to places that black activists just won't.
Yeah.
And what a power that is for you. And I wish you the greatest success, not just for the sake of like black sisters and brothers, but for the sake of the souls of really loving, well-intended white men who literally have no idea how busted they make the world by ignoring the connections between their personal convictions and that 40,000 people a year. So I'm thankful for your book being in the world. That's why I wanted to pass your story as best I can on to the people I have access to. So blessings and luck and all of those things to you in your journey. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the At Sea Podcast. If you would like to follow up with Taylor Schumann and find out what she's up to, you can visit Taylor Schumann, that's got 2 N's at the end of it, .com. You can order her book, which is called When Thoughts and Prayers Aren't Enough, from any of the sources you normally find books. If you'd like to be part of the team of folks who make this podcast happen, you can jump to patreon.com/Justin McRoberts and join this team. We would love to have you. Until next time.